welcome everybody to this event, What Has Evolution Done for Us? I'm Kate Revilius, a freelance science writer here in York, and previously I wrote for a feature article for New Scientist about Penny's work, so I'm really looking forward to finding out more today about what she's been up to. Before we start, a few technical notes. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, and this is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. If you have any technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. And please remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. Subtitles are available through the event, and to turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce our speakers for today. Professor Penny Spickens is a senior lecturer here at the university. Her research explores the complex and perhaps uniquely human emotions such as compassion, empathy, and gratitude. And her forthcoming book is Hidden Depths, the Paleolithic Origins of Human Connection. And hopefully we're going to find out a bit more about what she's written about today. With Penny today, we're also going to hear from Taryn Bell, who's a PhD researcher, and she focuses on how archaeologists can better understand emotional attachments to objects. Also, Callum Scott, a PhD candidate, who's researching the evolution of human cognitive diversity, ranging from personality differences to psychological conditions such as autism. And Gail Hitchens, a postdoc researcher whose research focuses on different aspects of social lives in the Paleolithic, particularly childhood care, and she specialises on Neanderthals. So welcome to all of you, and Penny, I'm going to hand over to you and hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. Well, it's fantastic to be here with you today. I'm going to be sharing my screen because I've got a talk I wanted to share with you. So my question for today, what has human evolution ever done for us? Now, I expect you recognize this phrase, or many of you do, maybe you're not quite as old as I am, from the Monty Python sketch, what have the Romans ever done for us? And the answer is the roads, the sewers, and everything else. And we thought it was kind of apt for today's environment because we're certainly feeling, aren't we? We're experiencing a pandemic, and we feel that biologically, evolution, it is kind of, that doesn't seem to have led to this perfect form we led to think that it might. And we're worried about climate change. So we're worried about how our behavior is affecting the climate. We're worried about inequalities. We're worried about conflicts. So we can end up with quite a negative view of how we got to be where we are today. And actually, I'm kind of not surprised we have a negative view, but that's not necessarily related to our strengths and the things that we've evolved to be able to do. Because one of the things we know about evolution is that it's made us focus on the negatives and the dangers in any situation. There's very good reason for that. We've been primed to survive, to be really alert to any lion-like thing that might be hanging around near us. And it may not be a lion, it may just be something, yellow in the distance. But by being primed to look at what might be dangerous or negative in our surroundings, we were more likely to survive. The trouble is, though, that we can bring that to bear on our evolutionary past as well. And perhaps one of the best examples of that comes from someone called Raymond Dart. Now, Raymond Dart is a famous paleoanthropologist. And he found a very important specimen called a town child in 1924. And our town child is a very early human ancestor. And Raymond Dart found broken gazelle bones with the remains of this really diminutive, you can see how small it is, this diminutive ape ancestor, which he called the southern ape. He found them at Makapansgat Cave in South Africa. Now, because he found broken gazelle bones with the crania of this species, and the crania had holes in the back, he came to the conclusion that that these gazelle bones were weapons of war, and this creature was an epically violent animal because there were holes in the back of the skull which he felt reflected where they'd been hitting each other on the back of the head with these horrible weapons, and these were violent apes. And in fact, these ideas led on to things like the film 2001 Space Odyssey, where you see those apes at the beginning who like suddenly realize they can start being violent and then supposedly successful. Now, of course, Raymond Dart had some awful experiences in the First World War, and he had, as a result, probably felt very negatively about humanity. But we later found that the broken gazelle bones weren't, in fact, weapons. They were just the remains of some kind of large cat den. And the holes in the back of the skull were probably where these small diminutive apes had been attacked by large eagles or cheetahs. And basically, these remains were in the den of hyenas or large cats, and they'd been cat food. So these were tiny, tiny little apes, not violent. And yet, and even when you look at this picture, you think, well, this is tiny. You know, why would you think that this tiny diminutive ape might have been uniquely violent? But it's not so surprising when we realize how instinctively and intuitively negative and alert to dangers we can be about our present, but also about our past. That's not to say that there aren't things we need to deal with today. Of course there are. But I'd like to convince you that actually in our evolutionary past, if we look back in time, we might find things that are tremendous strengths that we may not yet have recognized. Well, what can I possibly be talking about? Do we have some invisible strengths that we possibly don't really acknowledge? I think we do. I think we have certain advantages that really mark us out as quite distinctive, that are often largely invisible, and we often think of, in fact, as disadvantages. And as a result, they're entirely overlooked. I'm hoping you're wondering what I'm talking about. Well, to understand this, I think we have to start by looking for something missing in our story of human origins. And I'm going to ask and see if you think you might be able to spot it. So we're looking for something that's missing. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you two highly typical reconstructions from the Paleolithic period. And I've picked them fairly randomly. I could show you many more, but I don't want to spend too long. I'm just going to show you a couple. And I'm going to ask you, what's actually missing from these reconstructions? So I'm going to start. This is the first one. It's a reconstruction from Heyborough. It's a site in Britain dating to around 500,000 years ago. So we've got these classic early humans and animals all in a landscape. This is one. And here's another fairly classic image. Again, this is of modern humans. It's a classic image of modern humans who are hunting and gathering in the Upper Paleolithic period. So people who are anatomically like ourselves. And here we have, like, you know, again, the same reconstruction. So we're not going to do it in the question and answer. They do feel free to put things in if you want, but I'm just going to ask you to think about what's missing from these reconstructions. Well, okay, I think probably the first thing, and many of you might have got that already, is that there really aren't very many women or children or even elderly. And we do know that in our reconstructions, women often tend to be at the back or kneeling down. They're not so present. They're put in a more sort of passive pose. They're not allowed to hold sharp stuff, so they're never holding the weapons. And of course, we know that that's a completely misplaced view of human origins. Women were there. Any women that were completely incapable didn't survive to pass on their offspring. So we know that women were there. But there's something else that's missing from these reconstructions, and that's what I'd like to talk about. I think what's important here is in our reconstructions of our Paleolithic past, no one's injured, no one's ill, no one's vulnerable, no one's dependent on others. If we imagine that classic kind of human evolutionary progression where you've got, a line of several men becoming striding more confidently, this is all about single people. This is about individuals. This is about perfect bodies and perfect people. And this idea, I think, of humans as both individually independent and competitive and increasingly perfect has influenced much of our society over the last few decades. And actually, interestingly, I've also had a look at, when we look at some of our science fiction images as well, if you imagine the first kind of episodes of the earliest Star Trek, you've got exactly the same kind of drama playing out of men holding weapons, women sitting down, not holding weapons. Think of Lieutenant Uhura. She was never allowed to hold any of those really exciting gun things, was she? And nobody's ill or injured or vulnerable or dependent. And yet, societies in the past can't have been like that. Is this actually what we see in the archaeological record? Do we see these perfect people or these highly independent individuals? Actually, what we find is quite the opposite. And some of our research has shown that the skeletal record, in contrast, shows a real abundance of serious illnesses and injuries from which virtually no one escaped. Most of the individuals in the past we would consider today to come under the category of someone with quite a severe disability. In fact, many or most of them we would class as disabled in some form. So our evolutionary past was not about individuals, it's about something else: vulnerability and interdependence. One of my first examples, I'm going to take you through a few examples which go very quickly through our archaeological record. And one of my first examples comes from 1.6 million years ago. This is the thigh bone of a Homo ergaster female from East Africa. She died a long, slow death from hypervitaminosis A. But we can see the evidence of that in her bones. There's an outer layer in her bones that wouldn't normally be there. And she must have been looked after, fed, brought water, and defended from predators for many weeks. And that's more than the care which we sometimes see in our closest relatives, like chimpanzees. And this becomes quite common. If we move to 500,000 years ago, we look at a really interesting site called Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain. And there we found several individuals. This is a child who had craniosynthysis, so a torsioning of the crania, and who was looked after just like any other child. There's also an elderly man who could hardly walk and someone else who was most probably deaf. So out of 28 individuals who were deposited in a pit, at least 3, probably more, had quite notable injuries, and more than that, had been cared for by the others in their group. It's not really the message that we normally hear about the Paleolithic past. There's another example from 100,000 years ago of a child from Kafsa in Israel with traumatic cranial damage, again looked after just like any other child. A classic example from around about 60,000 years ago, which I know Gail is likely to be telling you a little bit more about. And this is the Neanderthal from Shanadar Cave with a withered arm and a withered leg, blind in one eye, probably deaf, looked after for at least 15 years since they sustained their injuries. And this is where you can see one arm bone on the other, which has just been withered. Care for injuries widespread in Neanderthals, and few reached adulthood without breaking a major bone. This is not what we're seeing in our reconstructions. And perhaps one of my favorite examples is this is a man from Man Bac in Vietnam. And you have to forgive me for including this example because it's not really in my time period. It's a bit too recent for me. 3,500 years ago is too near the present. But this is a Neolithic site, and that says Man Bac Burial 9. It's someone who's paraplegic, and they're cared for about a decade. And here we're looking at a huge investment, which would be demanding today, the provision of special food and being turned daily. So this is what our actual evidence tells us about remarkable vulnerability and interdependence and care. It's different from what we imagine. I think that's important because I think this is an important and very different story about our evolutionary past, in which vulnerability and interdependence may have made us particularly successful. I'm going to go on and explain that because we find this uncomfortable, though, don't we? We don't like vulnerability. We don't feel very happy with vulnerability. But I'd like to illustrate, or I'd like to convince you that our strength is vulnerability. Vulnerability of individuals, which meant that as a group, we work together. Because vulnerability is the basis for shared care of vulnerable young, which then can spend much longer growing up. So we can learn, we can grow big brains. For shared risks, which allow us to hunt dangerous large animals. And let's face it, we only have to look at our own bodies to know we're not built for hunting large and dangerous animals. But we can take the risks to do that because of that caring for injury. Sharing of food, all of these things work on a give and take mechanism, which is about vulnerability and interdependence. So actually, when we look at the ecological basis for our human evolutionary history, we see there's a straightforward ecological and evolutionary basis for caring for people who are vulnerable. And we find, perhaps surprisingly, that in highly collaborative mammals, such as social canids, like these African wild dogs or painted wolves, when individuals are injured, others in the group will provision them with food and look after them and protect them. And although we think, well, that's kind and we applaud that in some moral sense, they're doing it for good evolutionary reasons because the group depend on each other. And only by caring for each other can they all survive. They need each one of those hunting adults. So our motivations to care, our response to vulnerability, has actually evolved to solve, if you like, an economic problem of the need for give and take. So there's a particularly so there's an evolutionary reason why we would be compassionate, why we would be able to tolerate vulnerability and work within vulnerability as a group. And of course, also, there's a particularly human reason for compassion. Seeing a response to vulnerability also fosters trust within us and sends a kind of ripple effect, which allows us to create whole groups or societies that respond to each other empathetically. I think that's important. I think those capacities, which we see as vulnerabilities, are quite important for today. Sensitivity, our human sensitivity, which is really acute. We're really finely evolved to pick up on social cues about how other people feel, to respond to even a painting with an emotion about how we feel. I think that our human sensitivity is really important, and it feels like a vulnerability, but perhaps it's a strength. It's also important because it connects us to the animal world rather than divides us from it. A human sensitivity, it might be distinctive, but at the same time, it's based on our kind of biological responses to each other. And the fact that vulnerability has been a necessary part of our heritage pushes us perhaps to see a response to suffering as important and a lack of response to suffering or a lack of collection as perhaps not as natural as we might have previously assumed. So we also see, and I wonder if sensitivity is really important, should we also see some of that in the archaeological record? Well, I think that we do, because what we see is a sensitivity to animals around us. For example, this is a biface made, a hand axe made on an elephant bone. Now, hand axes made of elephant bones start to come into existence from around 1.5 million years ago, and they're not actually very useful. They seem to reflect some kind of connection to these highly empathetic animals that's reflected somehow in the creation of these tools. And even much later, everybody tends to assume that the domestication of wolves was a really economic thing, a functional thing. I argue that really, actually, it's our sensitivity that drove us to make new connections to animals, particularly wolves that then become dogs. And a rather wonderful example of that comes from probably the earliest accepted dog burial, which is around 14,000 years ago, in a site in Germany. And here there's a grave of a 50-year-old man and a 20 to 25-year-old woman with a dog who suffered from canine distemper. It died at 27 to 28 weeks, and it had canine distemper, periodontal disease, probably immune deficiencies, and was severely ill for most of its life. So it would have been unlikely to survive without considerable care. The only reason for which can have been that these people cared deeply for this dog and must have decided to look after it. So we're sensitive even in the midst of the Ice Age. And in fact, some of our research has also revealed how we're not just connected to dogs. I love talking about dogs. I could carry on talking about dogs for ages. We're not just connected to dogs. Over the last 100 to 200,000 years, we've seen a series of anatomical and genetic changes, which are very similar between humans and across the transition from wolves to domestic dogs. So much as dogs have become ultra sensitive and a little bit needy, we've also become ultra sensitive and a little bit needy in recent human evolution. What we see that our foreheads have gone from being flat here to becoming facing upwards like this, to do with a whole series of genetic changes. And we see similar changes happening in the transition from wolves to dogs. And for us, they allow us to make expressions of vulnerability with this part of our face, to look a little bit pathetic with our eyebrows, to make people respond, these sensitive people around us to respond, and to show our own sensitivities. But we're not the only ones that have done that. Wait till I show you this. I'm hoping that many of you are going, oh, just like dogs who can make this little eyebrow sort of twitch thing here that makes them look really rather pathetic. And this is my dog looking equally pathetic and making me feel sensitive to her vulnerability. We also make the same little changes above our eye to make ourselves look a little bit pathetic when we want to get a bit of an oh response from other people, not on purpose, of course. And we know that dogs that are able to move this part of their eyes are more likely to be rescued from dog shelters than the ones that have less mobility of that part of their eye. So I think that what human evolution has done for us is something very, very different from what we think. Yes, we have all sorts of issues in the modern world, but we have a hidden strength in a different story of who we are, because sensitivity and vulnerability and its response from others and the coherence that that gives societies are key to some of our greatest successes, to allowing us to hunt, to allowing expansion of the brain, to allowing connection across large communities where people feel for people they maybe don't know very well. It's central to how we connect to others, and is also, let's face it, this connection to others that's rather unique is also what often brings us some of the most joy. So what I'm going to do, I've stopped sharing now, and I'm just going to pass over straight on to Taryn Bell, who's going to tell us another area of human sensitivity that's really rather fascinating. So I'm going to pass over to Taryn for her view on sensitivity and vulnerability and emotions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Penny. So I too am going to share my screen. So as Penny has already touched on, humans are incredibly sociable. It's a core part of who we are. You know, over the last year, we've all come to realize the importance of our relationships with other people. You know, as a result of the pandemic, many more people are experiencing social isolation and loneliness. You know, I know from speaking to friends and family that it's been a really negative and lonely experience over the past year. Now, for me as a researcher, this is really interesting because I'm really interested in our social lives and, more importantly, what we do when we can't socialize with other people. Like I said, humans are hypersocial. So when our social relationships are affected in any way, this has really negative consequences for us. Now, when I say we're hypersocial, this isn't the same as being extroverted. It doesn't mean that we're all at heart raging extroverts. What it means is that it's really important for us to have a small number of close, intimate relationships. If you think about what life would have been like in prehistory, people would have been living in these small, close-knit bands. We are made to be surrounded by other people. So a lack of these close relationships with other people makes us more anxious, it makes us more stressed, and it even impacts our physical health. So how do we cope when these relationships are affected? Well, what evolution has done for us is it has given us a lot of flexibility in terms of what we call social relationships. So when you think of social relationships, you probably think of relationships with other people, but we have so many other sources of social support too. A very common one, for example, which Penny has already touched on, is our pets. They provide us with a lot of comfort, and I know during lockdown, a lot of friends have said how much difference it's made having a cat or a dog around. Religious and spiritual beliefs also provide tons of comfort to people. This belief in a higher power and the comfort of that relationship, that close relationship. But what my research is on is perhaps a slightly less obvious source of support, or a source of support that we tend to make fun of a little bit, and that's inanimate objects. So we are far more emotionally attached to objects than we realize. So if I give a classic example, this is my bear, Norris. You can see him on the screen, and if you can see me on camera right now, he's here sitting with me today again. I've had Norris since the day I was born, and when I was little, I used to carry him everywhere. We were completely inseparable. Once my mum said that he needed a wash, and I remember very clearly saying, if anything happens to him, I'll never talk to you again. I really am very attached to Norris even today. Obviously, I don't carry him around with me all the time anymore, despite the fact that he's sat next to me right now. But even today, if I'm feeling down or stressed, giving him a hug makes me feel better. And this is because Norris is what I would call an attachment object. He's an object to which I am emotionally attached. And this relationship brings very similar feelings and benefits to my social relationships with other people. We often think, though, about these attachment objects as being something that means that we are too childish or too materialistic, but neither of these are true. We are all capable of having some kind of attachment to objects. This is an ability that all humans have had throughout time. Not everyone shows it, but a lot of people do. Object attachment is very common. 70% of children across different cultures and as many as 50% of adults have some kind of attachment to an object. So it's a really common ability, even if a lot of people might not want to admit to it. What that object is very much differs from person to person. However, we all use these objects for very similar reasons. And what my research has shown is that we overwhelmingly use these objects when we're feeling insecure, when we're going through big changes, or simply when life is tough. And in turn, these objects make us feel safer, more secure, and more confident. And this has huge benefits for our mental and physical health. So back to that main question quickly, what has human evolution ever done for us? Well, my answer is that it's provided us with alternative ways to cope when times are tough, to cope with social isolation and loneliness. And evolution has also transformed our relationship with even the most mundane everyday objects, as Norris and I can definitely attest to. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to pass on to Callum.
And today I'm going to talk to you about how our psychological differences, which often can be viewed quite negatively, may have actually provided our species with a lot of advantages in the past. So I'm going to talk about two main forms of difference that we have, cognitive differences, and here I'm going to focus on autism or autism spectrum condition, and then secondly I'm going to talk about personality differences, and I'll focus on extroversion there. But before we go on to that, I just want to briefly go over why we actually have this variation in how we think, how we feel, how we behave. And that's because humans are very prone to mutations in genes associated with the brain. And these mutations are what have helped us to gain such a large brain so rapidly, but also it creates a lot of variation in how we think. And some of that variation has been maintained, I believe, because it provides individuals with advantages in different environments and situations. So autism spectrum condition is associated with a series of symptoms. However, it's also associated with a series of advantages, and often high functioning autism or Asperger's can go undiagnosed and isn't necessarily a problem. For example, in 2001, it was found that 6% of math Olympiads in Cambridge were diagnosed with an autism spectrum condition in that study without previously having known. So as Penny has shown here in her figure, autism spectrum condition is associated with a wide range of skills, but I just want to focus on one trait, and that's high attention to detail. So high attention to detail is a bias where you're more likely to focus on the details of an object instead of the overall picture. So before we talk about what advantages autism could have provided us with in the past, was autism actually there in the past? Short answer, yes. 70% of cases are due to selection, genes which have gone under selection and are inherited. So that's inherited from our ancestors, whereas 30% are due to spontaneous causes. And these spontaneous causes generally are cases which are more severe. They're associated with intellectual disability, whereas those which are inherited are less severe and more cases like Asperger's. So we did a series of surveys to look at what skills may have had an impact on our evolution. And the first survey, we found that the trait of autism, high attention to detail, was associated with having more experience of art outside of the classroom, engaging in art more. And we also found that that trait was associated with seeing more imaginary images when showing pictures of the stone wall, which is quite interesting because that links to a theory for the origins of art in the Paleolithic. So here we have a stone artwork at Refognac, and you can see here that there are these cobblestones on the wall, and those cobblestones have sort of been the inspiration for the formation of the top of the heads of the mammoths. So the theory is, and that's put forward by a colleague of mine, Derek Hodgson, that these natural cues on the cave walls were the inspiration for the artwork. And our survey has shown that individuals with the autistic trait, high attention to detail, are more likely to see these cues, more likely to have imaginary images, and therefore we can suggest that they may have been more likely to produce Paleolithic artwork. That's not saying individuals with autism specifically are more likely to produce it, but people with this trait of autism. So the second survey, we looked at how people relate to objects, and we found people with autism relate quite differently. So when they were asked what they would take with them during a disaster scenario, they said that they'd take more functional objects, whereas neurotypical people were more likely to take more sentimental objects. So functional objects, they're more likely to take a coat or a computer which has a lot of work on it so that they don't have to redo it, whereas more sentimental objects is photographs, jewelry, things which aren't really useful in a disaster scenario. And if you think in the past, during a harsh environment, if you're in a disaster scenario and you take something that isn't very functional, it could lead to you well, dying. So having individuals in the group who were taking more functional objects could have helped group survival a lot. And lastly, this isn't related to our surveys, but it's something I just want to mention. A lot of people who have Asperger's go into the sciences and engineering. So it's possible that people with traits of autism could be the innovators of populations, both in the present and in the past. Lastly, I just want to briefly talk about extroversion. So extroversion, it makes you more social, more outgoing and risk-taking. And largely it leads to you over the course of your life having more children, but having a lower life expectancy. And if you look at this graph on the right, what this is showing is that genes associated with extroversion increase as you go further away from Africa. So as we were leaving Africa, there was positive selection for extroversion. And the authors of this paper thought that it could either be due to a reproductive advantage, so having more children, or it could be that extroverts are just more likely to migrate. When I looked at this using a computer simulation, I found that people with extroversion, if I gave the extroverts, sorry, in this simulation a reproductive advantage, it creates that same distribution of extroverts being further away from Africa. So we can suggest that this reproductive advantage had a large impact on our movement out of Africa, particularly at the front of the wave of expansion in like low population density areas. So it's possible that personality had significant effects on key moments in our evolutionary history. So I just want to conclude by saying that our personality diversity may have actually helped groups survive in the past, may have increased our innovative ability, and may have helped us survive in new and challenging conditions and increased our species' survival and success. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and pass over to Gail.
Perfect, thanks Callum. I will also now share my screen. So I'm going to be talking a bit about people who care about us, so the importance of looking after each other in our evolutionary past, and specifically health-related care, which Penny touched upon a bit in that introduction. So we are very willing to care for others who have been impacted from illness and injury, and often go to a great extent to do this. And it's also something we can pick up in the archaeological record deep into our evolutionary past. Illness and injury is something that we look at as a standard as part of archaeology, but we can also look at evidence for healing and recovery and try to interpret what impact these conditions may have had, and if assistance would have been vital for that recovery to happen. For example, this wonderful image by Tom Bjorklund was inspired by a particularly famous case of illness and injury in Neanderthals, again, which was briefly mentioned in the introduction. This individual comes from a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, dating to around 60,000 years ago. At this site, we have multiple individuals, including men, women, and children, who have been purposely buried at different points in time. And this particular individual, known as Shanidar 1, had a lot to deal with. There was, looking at the skeletal material, we can see he had a violent blow to the face, possibly as a young adult, leaving only partial sight in the left eye, or perhaps even blindness. And also with the right arm, which had been fractured and healed, resulting in a loss of the lower arm and hand, and perhaps possibly even paralysis. There was also abnormalities in the leg and foot, which likely led to a painful limp. And also we were able to see bony growths in the ear, which have been identified. And this means that a hearing impairment was also quite likely. So as you can see, there was a lot of things to deal with there, and it certainly would have been some long-term issues with mobility, and likely some issues with manual tasks. And those problems with vision and hearing, you can imagine that would be particularly dangerous in environments at that time. However, these fractures and injuries occurred long before his death and are healed, and would have required some sort of intervention to have those bones set correctly. Shenandoah 1 also survived to around 40, 50 years old, an advanced age for this time. And this only seems possible with long-term adjustments by the group to support this individual. Of course, this is a very extreme example and shouldn't be seen as typical. We don't have individuals with this many conditions when you look at the archaeological record more widely. But it did lead us to have a look through Neanderthal skeletal material. And it soon became clear that we could see a range of recovery from illnesses and injury across the whole Neanderthal range. So here I've just put up a map it's got the main Neanderthal range where we get sites from them. And the black dots that you can see is key skeletal material in general, and the red ones you can see is sites where healthcare seems to have been very likely, and at some of these sites there's multiple individuals that seems to have been supported by the group and had some care. From this analysis that we did a few years ago, we could see begin to see what sort of assistance might have been a regular feature in Neanderthal groups. Wound cleaning and dressing would have been likely, because we have examples, again, an individual from Shenandoah where there was a scalp wound that had healed. And we've got numerous cases of healed broken bones. So again, some way of setting bones in order that they can heal well. There's also a number of cases of severe dental issues, so the diets would need to be changed, and numerous cases of where mobility and movement, broken legs, arms, ribs, joint disease as well. And so there would need to be recovery time with these injuries and assistance during this, and changing roles in the group would be needed on a short and long-term basis depending on the severity. There's also been some fascinating work on dental calculus in Neanderthals. So it's possible to chemically analyse the build-up of deposits on teeth and break down the different elements that have been ingested by different individuals. And amazingly, this has shown evidence for the potential use of medicinal plants by some Neanderthal groups. One element, for example, is poplar, which contains salicylic acid, and this is the active ingredient in aspirin. So it could be that we're seeing possible painkillers being used by some individuals. This all points, as I said, it's across the Neanderthal range that healthcare was an everyday experience for Neanderthals, and was fully established at that time. Helping others required knowledgeable support. We would argue that it was vital for these small groups where each person would have played such a crucial role. It was vital to look after every single person. And whilst I've just looked very briefly at Neanderthals today, it's also clear that the care of others can be pushed much deeper back into our evolutionary history, with some of the examples that Penny mentioned in the introduction. And it's becoming increasingly clear that this feature of cooperation has played an important role in our survival in the past, just as it does today. And with that, I will pass back. Thank you.
Thank you all so much, Penny, Taryn, Callum and Gail. It's been really fascinating, and I love the fact that you've all respun vulnerabilities to be something so positive and necessary to our evolution. Now, while other people are thinking about questions and typing them into the chat box, I just wanted to kick off the questions by asking to any of you, is there a cost associated with having these complex emotions? Do we need more brain power? Is there any evidence that there's, that there's a cost associated with it?
Oh, thanks, Kate. Yes and no, I guess, but that would be a typical kind of question, because in a sense, some of what happens with our emotions is quite biological. It's to do with hormone systems. So that's not necessarily a part of the brain that's very energetically costly. And we think that what's happening in evolution is we've got different hormonal responses to the people around us, so that we feel a response to their vulnerability. But of course, also in Gail's example of the Neanderthals with their medicinal knowledge and their knowledge of how to sort of, help broken bones, there we're talking about something that's more of a thinking response. So in a sense, this kind of response to vulnerability and our emotional connection involves both of those things. And that thinking response, yes, that does demand a certain amount of brain power and energy. But overall, I think I would say, and this is probably not something everyone would agree with, that for the past several decades, we've looked on human evolution as the rise of the clever people. Like we got cleverer and cleverer and cleverer, and our brains got bigger, and this is the narrative that drives everything. We've forgotten about the importance of people being kind and caring, and how that might have been very significant in the past. And that almost and how we could perhaps challenge a little bit that sort of doctrine that unless you're cleverer than anybody else, you're not going to do very well. And that might not necessarily have been at all true in the past.
Just following on from that, and perhaps this is one for Gail, because you mentioned that Neanderthals had this caring and compassion. Do we know anything about other species of human? Did they also show any signs of those emotions?
It's actually something we've been working on for the past year. That we've had this project looking at firstly at Neanderthal healthcare, where we could identify it, and we've currently been working on trying to see, can we push that back with earlier species. And well, the simple answer is yes, it does seem to have a much deeper root than perhaps been shown before. It might be that we can sort of start identifying different stages of sort of what was needed by the group to help these individuals, but it definitely has that deep evolutionary past, and definitely it's fully established by the time we get to Neanderthals, so it is much earlier than previously shown.
So we've got a question here in the chat from Arthur saying that the evolution of dog facial expressions, I think we all love that. And are there any other examples of how we've evolved alongside animals, or perhaps encourage them to become more humanized for connection?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I do rather love the way in which not just we've connected to dogs, but we've become a bit more like dogs, as we've gone along. There are some interesting examples actually where people have sort of deliberately or accidentally generated similar changes. So we know that urban foxes are starting to get the reduction in the snout length that we also see happening in dogs, because urban foxes are much more confident. Now, I don't know, I live in York, and we have a fox that comes around, and it stole our hedgehog water dish the other day. And they're just like, I used to live in the countryside, and the foxes in the countryside, you just see the end of a tail. Foxes in the cities, you really start to notice the confidence, the sort of, the more sociability, and that playfulness as well. So there's foxes, there's been some research on sort of pet rats and how they change, research on sort of mice, and we can see in a range of animals actually it's a very coherent response, this kind of reduction in the shape of the face associated with greater sensitivity, possibly more playfulness, a sort of a more emotional attunement, and it happens in various situations. So it's a fascinating area.
Wow. Okay, a question for Taryn here from Luna. Do you think there's a risk that technology could become our new attachment object for children and adults?
That's a really interesting question, because when I started my research, it's a bit frustrating trying to study object attachment, because for years no one talks about it at all. And now everyone's talking about it because they're talking about technology. So there is buckets and buckets of research out there particularly about the effects of mobile phones on teenagers. Which is really, really interesting. And I definitely think that technology, especially phones, are turning into attachment objects. What I would say, though, is that people tend to see these as a negative. They tend to see it as bad, that people are on their phones all the time. And yes, if your phone is getting in the way of your actual face-to-face interactions, then that is bad. But I think we also have to remember the brilliant things that technology can do for us, especially during lockdown, being able to phone my family and see their faces. It's been a really positive experience using technology for me. So yes, I definitely have become more attached to my phone over lockdown, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing.
And there's just a question that follows on from that from somebody else saying, is it possible to predict what kind of effect technology might have on our physical changes as people? So do you think our hands could develop more muscles, or, you know, what kind of sci-fi predictions have you got for us?
Really, really, really powerful thumbs so you can text much faster. That would be great. But honestly, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, to affect a physical change, I feel like you'd have to use it a lot. And I'm not quite sure, even if you text very fast, I'm not sure what kind of, I mean, Penny, you might be able to drop in on this, but I have no idea what effect that would have on the body.
Well, you'd have to go to Callum to ask about, because he does have, like, you know, he's got these extroverts that have more offspring, so there's an evolutionary advantage to being an extrovert. But do extroverts, are they better at technology? Because that's the only way, you know, you're going to start having some differences. You've got to be able to be reproductively successful, haven't you? So is technology, I mean, do we really want to go there? I think we maybe don't want to go quite to what does technology do to make us more reproductively successful. Maybe we shouldn't quite go on that. What do you think, Penny?
Extroverts are much more successful at presenting a self-image on Facebook and things like that. So it does actually have implications which could lead to better reproduction. But linking back to the question in terms of how objects may affect our muscles and everything, they already have. If you think of how our hand form has changed over time with the use of technology and hand axes, shortening of the is it shortening of the thumbs, Penny? Yeah. And yeah, so it already has. So I think, you know, will definitely have an effect going forward as well. Think of how shoes have changed our feet and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a really good question.
Actually, another question here for Callum. You spoke about how autism can be a strength. So, do you think increasing our knowledge of the history of these subjects can help to change today's societal views, such as a move towards using neurotypical and neurodiverse as descriptors of people?
I think it's going to have a big difference on how we view cognitive difference. Because if you go back to the 1990s, the biggest name in psychology wrote off personality difference, which is just general across the board. We all know we have personality difference. Wrote that off as just an effect of mutation or just sort of a write-off of selection, not having an effect on selection, so it's not important for evolution. We now know that's not the case. It does have an effect on selection. And it's the same when we talk about cognitive differences as well, like autism. We know that these can have positive effects as well for a population, in particular the traits associated with those conditions. So the more we learn about how these conditions, how these variations have affected us in the past, I think it will definitely change how we view them in the present. And it may lead to, I don't know, Penny, you may want to feel this one a little bit as well. It may lead to the term neurodiversity, which is more and more being considered a label of something which doesn't exist, being dropped.
And I think, yeah, exactly. I'd agree, Callum. I mean, you've got the general point. I think people are much more aware that there maybe isn't just one type of normal mind, you know, that different people with different minds are making a contribution across the different range of conditions where we now see their advantages and disadvantages. But that, you know, sadly, a lot of things in our world are made for a normal in inverted commas mind, our idea of how a person ought to be. And that was probably never true in the past. In small groups of people, they could accommodate people who were quite different quite happily, and they brought different strengths. But in a big kind of bustling world that we live in, you know, so many things are made for kind of the average person, aren't they? And I hope that would change. I think we'd get better at recognizing that there are differences, and people with differences bring different skills and talents.
We've got a question here from from Rosie, and she talks about dental work, which she says, you know, has that cancelled out the biological evolution of we don't any longer need to, you know, we have dental work to solve our teeth problems. She wonders if there are any other similar examples where evolution has counteracted or challenged biology. And would medicine come under that category?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite important at the moment, because it's easy to think that medicine and healthcare is a recent thing. And actually, it's so integral to all of our origins. I mean, if you just look at one of the classic examples is assisted births. So there are some primates that practice sort of birth assistance, but because we've got large brains, because we have difficult births, birth assistance we know goes way back into our evolutionary past. But without it, then we might not be able to have those large brains. So actually, we've evolved alongside care. We would probably be different. Our whole biological form, our whole anatomy might be different without that, because only by being able to take injury risks could we hunt large game, in being able to take those injury risks because we'd be cared for. So we might have been a completely different, well, not completely different, but a subtly different size, shape, physiology, anatomy without that.
I'm going to throw in one one last question. There's many more, and I wish we had time for them all. But Frank's asked, caring for those who are disabled takes a lot of work. So how does caring aid our survival and flourishing?
Okay, so it's a very good question, actually, and it's one that we come across quite a lot, because people say, oh yeah, but if you care for someone, this is quite costly, and we sort of measure the energetic costs of things and go, well, that's a costly thing to do. We have to look at how evolutionary processes, how we evolve tendencies to do anything, because our behaviors aren't inherited, not the behavior itself. We inherit kind of dispositions, emotional dispositions, and the capacities for thought. So what that means is, imagine that you needed to evolve a way of caring for 99% of the people that have like quite a small injury or illness that can quickly be dealt with. And you want to look after those. It's very small energetic cost. Yeah, because then they'll be back in your group and they'll be work. So just from a purely economic point of view, you want to look after 99% of people, and the 1% you from your purely rational point, you think, right, you can't evolve that, because what evolves is a capacity to care for the people you care about. And there's a very small energetic cost from those tiny percentage of people that are very costly, like Shanadar Man's, costly to look after in real terms. But for every Shanadar man, there's like at least 100 small injuries or illnesses, or maybe takes a few months. And we see in modern hunter-gatherers that, almost everyone has had a period of illness or injury where others looked after them. And of course, that's not their whole life. And most of us have a period of illness or injury where we're looked after by everyone else. And of course, that's not our whole lives. But to make that work, we have to be motivated no matter what the cost.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But it's been a really, really fascinating talk, and it's left me with so many things to think about, and I'm sure it has everybody else. Can I just remind everybody that the recording of this event is available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section after the 20th of June. And anyone who's registered for this talk will be contacted via email when the video is available. And we hope that you'll continue to be engaged with the festival ideas, and do go and check out the other events that are coming up on the festival programme, and share your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag #YorkIdeas. And thank you all for coming along, and thank you once again to all of our speakers, Penny, Taryn, Callum and Gail.